Welcome to Disability Rights Ohio's Ask an Advocate series. We're chatting with disabled activists who are fighting for change. My name is Alexia Kemerling, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator at Disability Rights Ohio. Today, we're talking with Maria Matzik. Maria is the Education and Advocacy Specialist at the Access Center for Independent Living in Dayton, Ohio. Thank you for joining us, Maria. Let's both just start off with our visual descriptions. So I'll go first. I am a white woman in my early 20s with shoulder length wavy blonde hair. I'm wearing a black long sleeve sweater, and my background has the Disability Rights Ohio logo, and it has a label that says Ask an Advocate with Alexia Kemerling.
I'm Maria, and my visual description is I'm a white female in her 50s. I have dark and gray curly hair, and I have glasses. I'm in a reclining wheelchair with a printed shirt on. I have a ventilator and a trach. And my background is a brown wall, a brown cabinet, and a table with a basket and a lamp on it. My pronouns are she and her.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maria. So we'll just get right into our questions. One thing that has always interested me as a disabled person is just how recent our history is. As part of the ADA generation myself, meaning the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed before I was born, I've always wondered, what has it been like to grow up before the ADA and then to see it passed?
That's a great question. I have a lot of mixed feelings about that. So before the ADA, I was in segregated schools. So the first two schools that I attended, one was actually called the School for the Physically Handicapped. That was the name of the school. Or they would say PH school, physically handicapped school. And then when it became, I guess it would be when IDEA became more prominent, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We were mainstreamed into classes. Well, first, our class was taken out of the PH school and moved to a regular school, so to speak. So we were the only classes. I think there were two classes of disabled students. So we were still segregated, but we were in a school with other individuals that didn't have disabilities. And that was kind of unique for some of the students because some of them were very isolated, and so they weren't around a lot of folks without disabilities. I grew up with predominantly non-disabled friends. My only disabled friends were actually my school friends. So I kind of had both worlds mixed into one for me. But then, when I was younger, it was just normal. If we were going to go somewhere, my mom would call somewhere, say, my daughter's in a wheelchair. Do you have steps? And if they had steps, we just wouldn't go there. And if they didn't have steps, then we went. And that was really the only accommodation that we ever even thought about. Could I get inside or not? We never thought about restrooms, any of that. I just didn't even bother with that. It's just, can I get in the building? And so the ADA was passed my first year of college, and I didn't even know what was happening. I heard about all this, hype about this, the law that would make equal access for people with disabilities. And we started studying about it. And I'm like, why didn't I know about this? I never heard about this. I didn't know that people were protesting for years and going to jail. for our rights. I had no idea. And I was already my own advocate. I had to fight for a lot of changes for me, but to see a lot of other people fighting for their rights just kind of opened my eyes to a bigger world of change and possibilities. And as a college student, you're already looking at the future with, big doe eyes of everything you can make better in the world. And this was just one more thing that was happening. But as the ADA rolled out and you saw, it wasn't quite as clear kind of a law as what everybody thought. And we all had a responsibility to fight for the implementation of the ADA, that it became burdensome. So now when I go out, if a place doesn't have the accommodations that I know legally that they should have, it's now my responsibility to make that an advocacy issue and to fight for that. Where in the past, I could just go somewhere or not go somewhere, and that's just how it was. And so sometimes I think, I would just like to go out sometime and not have to have my disability and the fight for change as part of everything. I would just like to enjoy something like everybody else does. Be able to go to a building, go to a show, go to an event, know that I can get in, know that I can use a bathroom if I need to use the bathroom, know that my friends who might be deaf or, or blind have accommodations that they need to enjoy the same event I'm enjoying. But that's not how it is. So it's hard sometimes.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's a really interesting perspective that I think a lot of non-disabled people might not think about. So it kind of leads me to my next question. You mentioned that even before you learned about larger advocacy movements, you were kind of always your own advocate. But if your experience was similar to mine, I'm sure that was kind of just a normal part of your life. So I'm curious of when did you start identifying or calling yourself an advocate?
I don't know when I actually started calling myself as an advocate. Advocacy was part of just, growing up with a disability and seeing my mother fight, for my inclusion in every part of my education or society as a whole. But I guess when I really saw that I could make a change and I could be part of something bigger than just my own fight was when I learned about ADAPT, which is the Americans with Disabilities. I'm sorry, Americans with Disabilities. It's the Americans disabled for attendant programs today. And prior to that, they were Americans disabled for accessible public transportation. So they started out fighting for lifts on buses. Then they moved into like the ADA fight, and then community-based services and getting people out of institutions. So when I learned about that, I went to my first ADAPT action, which was in Michigan. That was it. Like I found my community. I found my people. And I had never felt like I belonged anywhere. Growing up with a disability, you have your friends, but you're not really part of their group because there are things that they're going to go do that you just can't do. and you had to accept that. So, I was like the cool disabled person that could get somebody to the front of a line at an amusement park, right? But I wasn't the cool disabled person that could go on a field trip with everybody because 9 times out of 10, they didn't have a bus with a lift. So to go to an adapt action, at least back then, so that would have been in like 1995 for me. It was amazing. It was bigger than life. I never saw so many disabled people in one place at one time. And then able bodied people who were there solely for the purpose of what the disabled people were doing, as opposed to the other way around, where we were just the tag alongs to somebody else. They were there for us, and they were as invested in the protest as we were. It was amazing. It was moving. It just, you felt like you were at home in a different way than you ever felt before. So I think that I found my advocacy voice through ADAPT, and I learned how to be an advocate. I learned the right way and wrong way to effectively make change and to work with a group to make change. I learned about bigger issues like euthanasia and Not Dead Yet, which I remember being taught about that in school because I was in rehabilitation counseling. That's what my degree is in. So we learned about death and dying and the right to die and death with dignity. And it was presented in such a way that you kind of bought into it. Well, yeah, of course, if you're suffering, if you're in pain, it's humane to have the option to die with dignity, die with less suffering. When I learned about Not Dead Yet, and I saw the complete discrimination of what that really meant, that it meant that because you're disabled, that you have a right to die and you have a right to ask for help to die, because obviously your disability makes it that your life isn't worth living. I mean, who would want to live that way? And I never saw it that way until I went into the hospital. And it was in 93. And I had respiratory failure and I had issues with the settings on my ventilator. But I didn't know what was really happening. I just knew I was really sick and having trouble breathing. So I was 23 at the time. And in the ER, the nurse said to my mother, "Does she have advanced directives?" And my mother was like, I don't even know what that is. And she was like, do you know what advanced directives are? And I was like, no, but why are you not talking to me? And the nurse was like, oh, well, that just means that if you have a document that says what your wishes are, if your heart should stop. And I was like, what? What do you mean what my wishes are? I would want to be revived if something happens. And she looked at me and said, oh, it doesn't matter. We wouldn't revive you anyway. And I was just like, what? And it just hit me like what all this meant. I had never experienced such blatant disregard for human life and never realized how people with disabilities were really viewed, that our lives aren't worth living.
Yeah, that's really horrifying, the cavalier way that was just said to you. Wow. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I think you shared a lot about kind of getting connected and how that fueled your advocacy. What else would you say motivates your advocacy?
Um, well, like I said, when I saw Adapt and participated with Adapt, it really made me realize that, the fight isn't just my fight. And I think that a lot of times growing up as a person with a disability, as opposed to acquiring your disability later, you feel alone. You feel isolated. And for me, growing up before social media and the internet and all of that, my only connection with people with disabilities were at school. And a lot of them did have intellectual disabilities. So we were not on the same level cognitively. I had a couple of friends who I can engage in discussions about our future, but most folks didn't have much of a future ahead of them because there weren't people who were going to encourage them, support them, and fight for them. And so I think that, knowing where I came from and seeing folks who I knew died very young, or went to institutions, or just, were left to figure it out and hope for the best, but probably didn't get real far in life. And then saw the fight that Adapt had, not that Yet had. I saw the need for involvement, I guess, in the disability community to fight for everyone's rights. Because now I saw that there were a lot of people who were just like me fighting for the same thing. And if one person could make a difference, wow, 10, 20, 1,000 people could surely make a difference. And I wanted to be part of that change.
Yeah, I definitely really identify with that. It's a lot easier and more satisfying fighting alongside people than just by yourself for yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one reason we really wanted to talk with you for this series is the advocacy group that you lead in Ohio, the Breaking Silences Advocacy Committee. Could you talk a little bit about that group and maybe what role that kind of collaboration and networking plays in your advocacy today?
Sure. So Breaking Silences, it actually started as a conference back in 2006, 15 and 2017. So it was at Wright State University here in Dayton. And it was a conference about inclusion. It was about sexuality. It was about every disability related topic you can think of. And it brought all the communities together because people don't think about the fact that, disability is part of every community, and disability and the disability culture is the only culture that anybody can and probably will enter at any time in their life. People they don't want to ever think they could be disabled, and that's such a bad thing. So Breaking Silences embraced disability. It embraced disability pride, and it showed the diversity of our community, and it celebrated that. Well, out of that conference, we saw a big need for a space for individuals who identified both as a person with a disability and a person who was part of the LGBTQ plus community. That there was a lot of struggles for those individuals, because if you had both identities, neither community really embraced you. So the disability community, they weren't really open to the LGBT folks, and the LGBT folks didn't really want the disabled folks because they weren't that pretty and that nice looking. So we offered a Breaking Silences peer group for folks to come and have a safe space to share their experiences. And that started in 2018. And that went on for probably a year and a half. And then we kind of disbanded. We really just put it on hold to look at it a little bit closer. We weren't getting a lot of participants toward the end. So we put that on hold. Well, when the pandemic hit in 2000, we started to see a need for virtual space for people to come and be with others in such an isolated time and such a frightening time for everybody. So we brought back the Breaking Silence peer group, and we opened it to everyone. So it wasn't exclusively for folks that had, the identity of both communities, but anybody could join. And we did that for, I'd say, maybe a month and a half. And we started seeing some really significant issues coming out of that group. Issues like the caregiver crisis, accommodations for people, pay for their caregivers, insurance for people with disabilities. So instead of taking up the time that was dedicated as a peer group, we decided we were going to have a second group and call it the Breaking Silences Advocacy Committee. And I agreed to host it. And we've been meeting ever since, I believe it was the end of April in 2020. And so we meet virtually, and we will continue to meet virtually until there's no more issues that we have to deal with.
That's awesome. I really love what you said about the disability community in general. That's one of my favorite things too, is it's the largest minority group in the world and it's so diverse. But even across like different disabilities, there's still those shared experiences, which I think is really cool. Like you and I have very different disabilities, but we still have had some of the same feelings and experiences. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.